Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss the 1958 version of The Fly, starring David Hedison, Herbert Marshall, Vincent Price, Patricia Owens, and Kathleen Freeman, directed by Kurt Newman. Now, before I get into this movie, no, I am not doing the sequels, and yes, I will be doing the 1986 version next time. So, just to clear that out of the way, I have seen this movie before, and I don't remember too much about it until this viewing, so let's get into it. We open the credits with the fly buzzing in your ears like it's bugging you to death, as well as the score, and we open the movie in a town as a cat runs around the streets in a factory, and a security guard clocks in for the graveyard shift because it's nighttime, and the security guard hears some noises coming in a factory as a woman runs out and he sees blood, and we move on to Helene Delambre, played by Patricia Owens, calling in her brother-in-law, Francois, played by Vincent Price, saying she killed Andre, played by David Hedison, and Francois calls Inspector Charest, played by Herbert Marshall, as Charest tells Francois takes Francois to the crime scene in the factory when he was almost done with the game of chess. And the acting in this is cheesy for damn sure. And the shots are interesting to look at, and I like the characters as they felt guilt, particularly Helene for killing her husband, and they have a son named Philippe, played by Charles Herbert, and the performances are pretty good in this movie. Francois goes to the house with Inspector Charest and interrogates Helene, while she refuses to answer questions a couple of times, which is not how interrogations work. While Helene confesses she actually killed Andre, and she hears a fly and sees the fly while she smacks off her lampshade, as she explains how she pushed the button twice while Inspector Charest is interrogating her, and the inspector goes to Francois and another guy as he believes her, and they go in a basement, and the cinematography was fine to look at throughout the movie. While Francois is asked about if he tested something on animals or bugs, as he answers no, he wouldn't hurt a fly. As the next day comes and Helene gets breakfast in bed, while Nurse Anderson, played by Betty Lou Gerson, brings it to her, as they hear the fly, and there's something suspicious with Helene after Nurse Anderson killed the fly, and the acting was sometimes painful, even in that scene in particular. Francois talks with Inspector Charest while Charest is thinking of Helene as guilty, and he has dinner with Philippe. And Philippe tells Francois about a fly Helene was obsessed with to not kill, and I'm believing Andre is the fly in this movie, as Francois calls Inspector Charest and suddenly decides to hang up, and he goes to the house to speak with Helene about the fly, which happens to be Andre, and Francois has in his desk while she's pretending to be mad for Philippe's sakes, which sounds crazy, and she asks Francois to kill the fly and brings Inspector Charest, as she confesses how he will turn into a fly by switching places with it, while Philippe plays with the cat that they have, and the sound effects have good timing, particularly with the fly, as it works for a late 1950s monster movie. We witness why Andre wants to be the fly, as the car comes in and gets some milk and prepares the machine and puts the cat in the machine. And I'm thinking to myself, is something going to happen to that cat as it disappears and we hear it meow, and hopefully the cat doesn't die, but we'll never see him again for the rest of the movie. But the flashback scene is reasonable enough. Andre becomes distant from Helen and Philippe and tells Helene he's successful and takes her to the ballet as he writes something down, and they finish the ballet and finish the night off with some champagne in his laboratory, and he makes it switch places and puts in a guinea pig, as this guy is acting like a magician, as the guinea pig is alive, unlike the cat, as we hear it's in space somewhere for cats. And yeah, I'm not believing you on that. And hopefully it's still alive, as they celebrate the machine as a success, and Helene asks no more experiments on animals, as he makes the promise while she takes care of the guinea pig. And the next day comes, Andre is sitting outside looking at the sky while Helene joins him, which is romantic, and I like the chemistry between Andre and Helene, and they have good chemistry. Francois comes over to the house, and Philippe catches a fly and shows Helene she doesn't approve and tells him to let it free. And Helene comes down to find Andre in the laboratory, and he gives out a note saying he's had an accident and it's a matter of life and death. And Helene gets Andre a bowl of milk with some whiskey and warns her about a fly to catch but not to kill it. And we don't see his head when Helene comes in the laboratory and she hears Andre drinking, and she sees the hand is a fly, and she's freaked out, and he forces her to, and she helps him out anyways, which is a scare that didn't work for me, but to be fair, it was the late 1950s, so what do you expect? Helene asks Philippe to catch a fly without harming it and letting it outside, but they were unsuccessful, and Helene cries when they don't get the fly, while Andre tells Helene to destroy the laboratory as well as himself, which seems melodramatic. Meanwhile, Andre writes he can't wait or else he can't think straight, and writes on the board, while Helene suggests to try to see some colleagues, but he can't because it'll get worse as time goes on. And he tests the machine, but his head turns into a fly. As Helene screams, which felt like a cheap scare for a reveal that felt 1950s, while the fly tries to take control, touching Helene, but Andre won't let it have control, and he destroys the laboratory as Helene wakes up and sees the monster in him, and he writes in the board, "Help me, and kill fly, please. And love you," as the fly goes outside to the factory. Helene kills him with the machine, and that's when he gets to the start of the movie, which makes sense to connect the dots from the beginning of the movie. We come back to after the death of Andre with Helene, Francois, and Inspector Chirac, as Helene is glad the fly is dead, and Inspector Chirac leaves with arresting Helene, or almost leaves, as Francois doesn't want her arrested unless Inspector Chirac sees the fly, and the authorities arrest Helene, as Philippe sees the Andre as the fly and shows Francois and Inspector Chirac as they find the fly on a spider web, and it's calling out, "Help me!" And the spider gets closer. Not only does Inspector Chirac kill the spider, but Andre himself, and Inspector Chirac releases Helene as the movie ends with Francois explaining how his father died because of his work, and takes Philippe to the zoo. And the climax was corny for sure, but I liked the movie fine. But let's see what the rating is. I'll give this movie a 6.9 out of 10. It can be cheesy at times for damn sure, as the shots are interesting to look at, and I like the characters as they feel guilt from start to finish, as the performances are pretty good in this movie. The cinematography was fine to look at throughout, and there were times the acting was a tad bit painful, but the sound effects have good timing, particularly with the fly, as it works for a late 1950s monster movie. The actors have good chemistry with each other, and hopefully nothing bad happened to the cat for the rest of the movie. While the scares are cheap for the late 1950s, but don't get me wrong, I did like the movie, as it's a recommendation, as it was a good first try for The Fly, despite I'm not completing the series until the rest of them go on streaming. Maybe I'll do it then. But I'll do the remake next time, and I will be back next time with the remake of the David Cronenberg version. And until then, help me!